The golden age of Hollywood is often remembered as a time of elegance, strict rules, and carefully controlled public images. Movie stars are presented as perfect symbols of beauty, romance, and traditional values. Studios worked hard to protect these images, hiding anything that did not fit society's expectations. But behind the glamorous costumes, bright lights, and carefully written fan magazines, there was a much more complex and hidden world. Long before modern conversations about gender identity and self-expression became common, many performers were already challenging those boundaries in bold and creative ways. Their stories were rarely told openly, and in many cases, they were deliberately erased from history. In the early 20th century, American entertainment was not limited to Hollywood films. Vaudeville theaters, Broadway stages, traveling shows, and nightclubs were just as important as the silver screen. These spaces allowed performers to experiment with identity, fashion, and performance in ways that would later become controversial. Among these performers were artists who built careers by presenting themselves in ways that crossed traditional gender lines. Some were known as female impersonators, others were gender nonconforming entertainers, and some lived their private lives very differently from how society expected. At the time, there was no modern language to describe these experiences, and most audiences did not ask questions as long as the performance was entertaining. As Hollywood grew more powerful, studios began enforcing strict moral standards. The idea of a clean and wholesome image became essential for success. Anything that challenged traditional ideas of masculinity and femininity was seen as dangerous. As a result, many performers who had once been celebrated were pushed out of mainstream entertainment. Their contributions were forgotten, ignored, or intentionally left out of official Hollywood history. What remained was a carefully edited version of the past, one that made the Golden Age appear far more conservative and uniform than it truly was. This article explores the forgotten history of entertainers from the Golden Age and earlier periods who challenged gender norms through their performances and personal lives. These were not people trying to deceive audiences, but artists using costume, voice, movement, and character to tell stories and entertain. In many cases, their work required extraordinary skill, discipline, and courage. They faced legal restrictions, social judgment, and sometimes violence simply for expressing themselves. Yet despite these challenges, they left a lasting impact on entertainment, influencing comedy, music, theater, and even modern drag culture. It is important to understand these stories within their historical context. Concepts like gender identity, sexual orientation, and self-expression were not openly discussed in the early 1900s. Many performers had to navigate a society that offered them no protection and little understanding. Some chose to separate their stage personas from their private lives, while others lived fully in the identities they created. Each story is different, but together they reveal how rich and diverse early entertainment culture truly was. By looking back at these performers with honesty and respect, we gain a deeper understanding of Hollywood's past and the people it chose to remember or forget. Their stories challenge the idea that gender expression is a modern invention and remind us that creativity has always existed beyond society's rules. The Golden Age was not only a time of classic films and famous stars, but also a period shaped by brave artists who dared to live and perform differently, even when the world was not ready to accept them. Julian Elton was one of the most famous entertainers in America during the early 1900s, yet today his name is almost completely forgotten. At the height of his career, Elton was not a hidden figure or fringe performer. He was a mainstream star, earning enormous salaries and drawing massive crowds wherever he performed. Born William Julian Dalton in 1881, Elton became known for his incredible talent as a female impersonator at a time when vaudeville and theater were major forms of entertainment. His ability to transform himself on stage amazed audiences and made him one of the most talked-about performers of his era. What made Julian Elton stand out was how realistic his performances were. Unlike many performers who played exaggerated or comedic versions of women, Elton's focused on precision and detail. He carefully studied how women walked, spoke, and carried themselves. His costumes were elegant, his makeup flawless, and his movements graceful. Audiences were often stunned when, at the end of his performances, he would remove his wig and reveal his male identity. This dramatic reveal became one of the most famous moments of his shows and helped cement his reputation as a master of transformation. Elton's popularity reached incredible heights. In 1912, he became so successful that a Broadway theater in New York City was named after him, the Julian Elton's Theater. This honor was extremely rare and showed just how much influence he had in the entertainment world. He was also one of the highest paid performers of his time, earning around $3,500 a week, which would equal tens of thousands of dollars today. Elton was not just a performer. He was a brand, a household name known across the country. Despite his success on stage, Elton lived in a society that was deeply uncomfortable with men who performed as women. To protect his career, he carefully managed his public image offstage. In photographs and interviews, he presented himself as aggressively masculine. He was often shown boxing, lifting weights, smoking cigars, and engaging in activities meant to reassure the public of his masculinity. This contrast between his stage persona and his public image reveals the intense pressure performers face to conform to strict gender expectations. Elton eventually made the transition to Hollywood, appearing in silent films such as The Countess Charming and The Isle of Love. However, as American culture began to shift in the 1920s and 1930s, tolerance for female impersonation decreased. Laws were introduced in many cities that restricted or banned men from wearing women's clothing in public. Female impersonation, once a popular and respected art form, became associated with moral panic and social fear. By the late 1930s, Julian Elton's career had collapsed. In Los Angeles, laws even prohibited him from appearing in women's clothing on stage. In a heartbreaking final act, he was forced to perform beside a rack of dresses, pointing to the outfits he was no longer allowed to wear. The man who once owned Broadway now stood as a symbol of how quickly public opinion could turn against an artist. When Elton died in 1941, much of America had already forgotten him. His story reflects the cruelty of cultural change and the way society often erases artists who challenge its rules. Julian Elton was not simply a performer in costume. He was a skilled artist whose work shaped early American entertainment. Remembering his life helps us understand how deeply gender expression has always been woven into the history of performance. Bert Savoy was one of the most colorful and influential entertainers of the vaudeville era, known for a performance style that was loud, bold, and intentionally exaggerated. While some female impersonators focus on creating a perfect illusion of femininity, Savoy did the opposite. He made it clear to audiences that they were watching a performance, not a transformation meant to deceive. Born Everett McKenzie, Savoy built a career around humor, sharp timing, and a flamboyant stage presence that made him unforgettable to anyone who saw him perform. Savoy's stage persona was instantly recognizable. With bright red hair, heavy makeup, and extravagant costumes, he presented a cartoon-like version of womanhood that delighted audiences. His comedy relied on quick wit, exaggerated gestures, and catchphrases that became famous across the country. His most well-known line, "You don't know the half of it, dearie," was repeated by fans far beyond the theater walls. During the 1920s, this phrase entered everyday speech, showing just how deeply Savoy had entered popular culture. What made Bert Savoy especially important was his influence on other entertainers, including some who would go on to become Hollywood legends. Many historians believe that Mae West, known for her bold sexuality and sharp humor, drew inspiration from Savoy's exaggerated performance style. In an interesting twist, West's famous persona was partly based on a man who was performing an exaggerated version of a woman. This layered performance of gender shows how entertainment during this period was far more complex and fluid than it is often remembered today. Savoy was a major star of the vaudeville circuit, performing in top theaters and earning large audiences wherever he went. His performances were not hidden or underground. They were mainstream entertainment enjoyed by families and theater-goers across America. At a time when films had not yet taken over popular culture, vaudeville performers like Savoy were among the most famous entertainers in the country. Despite his success, Savoy lived in a society that was slowly becoming less accepting of gender nonconforming performers. As the 1920s came to an end, moral standards tightened, and entertainers who challenged traditional norms faced increasing criticism. However, Savoy's career ended not because of public rejection, but due to a tragic and bizarre accident that seemed almost theatrical in its timing. In 1923, while walking along a beach in New York during a thunderstorm, Savoy reportedly pointed to the sky after a lightning strike and jokingly said, "That'll be me, darling." Moments later, he was struck by lightning and killed instantly. The dramatic nature of his death shocked fans and seemed strangely fitting for a performer who lived his life with such flair and humor. He was only 36 years old. After his death, Burt Savoy's name slowly faded from popular memory. As Hollywood films replaced vaudeville and moral rules became stricter, performers like Savoy were no longer celebrated. His influence, however, remained. Element of his style lived on through other entertainers who borrowed his humor, confidence, and bold approach to performance. Savoy's story reminds us that early American entertainment was not shy or restrained, but loud, daring, and full of personalities who challenged social expectations long before modern conversations about gender and identity began. Ray Bourbon was one of the most controversial and daring entertainers of early 20th century America, a performer who consistently pushed boundaries at a time when doing so could destroy a career or even lead to arrest. Born Hal Wadsworth, though some records dispute details of his early life, Bourbon built a reputation as a sharp-tongued comedian and female impersonator whose performances openly challenged social norms. Unlike many entertainers who tried to soften their image to survive in a changing cultural climate, Bourbon leaned into provocation, refusing to hide the boldness of his material or the ambiguity of his personal life. That Bourbon's performances were not subtle. He used comedy, music, and suggestive language to confront audiences with topics that polite society preferred to ignore. His act included songs and spoken routines that directly referenced gay life, desire, and social hypocrisy. At a time when homosexuality was widely condemned and criminalized, Bourbon's willingness to be openly suggestive made him a target for censorship and law enforcement. Record companies refused to distribute his work, forcing him to sell his recordings directly to fans at live shows, often in secret. Despite these obstacles, Ray Bourbon developed a loyal following. He performed in nightclubs, theaters, and underground venues where audiences appreciated his honesty and fearless humor. His act gave voice to people who rarely saw their experiences reflected on stage. For many, Bourbon was more than an entertainer. He was a symbol of resistance against a society that demanded silence and conformity. However, this same defiance made it nearly impossible for him to achieve lasting mainstream success as American culture became more conservative in the 1930s and 1940s. Bourbon found himself increasingly pushed to the margins of entertainment. Laws regulating public morality became stricter, and performers who did not fit traditional expectations were often labeled as threats to social order. Bourbon's refusal to adjust his material meant he was shut out of Hollywood and mainstream theaters. While other performers attempted to adapt or hide parts of themselves, Bourbon continued performing on his own terms, even as his opportunities shrank. The later years of Ray Bourbon's life were marked by tragedy and isolation. In 1968, at the age of 76, he was arrested for murder under circumstances that remain unclear and poorly documented. He was convicted and died in prison in 1971. The shocking end to his life further distanced him from public sympathy and ensured that his name would be quietly removed from most official histories of American entertainment. What makes Ray Bourbon's story particularly important is how completely he's been erased from the mainstream narrative. Despite influencing future generations of comedians and performers, his name rarely appears in books or documentaries about early American entertainment. This absence speaks volumes about how history is often shaped by comfort rather than truth. Performers who challenge social norms too directly are often excluded, regardless of their artistic impact. Ray Bourbon's life reminds us that entertainment has always been a space for rebellion as well as pleasure. His refusal to soften his voice or hide his identity came at a high personal cost, but also left a powerful legacy. By understanding Bourbon's story, we gain a clearer picture of the risks faced by early gender nonconforming performers and the courage required to speak openly in an era determined to silence them. Barbette was one of the most visually striking and artistically ambitious performers of the early 20th century, blending breathtaking physical skill with deep symbolic meaning. Born Vandalay Broadway in Texas, Barbette became famous for a trapeze and tightrope act that challenged audiences not only through danger, but through ideas about gender and identity. Unlike many entertainers who use female impersonation primarily for comedy or illusion, Barbette turned it into a form of high art that fascinated critics intellectuals, and fellow performers around the world that Barbette's performances followed a carefully structured format that made them unforgettable. He would appear on stage dressed as an elegant woman, wearing glamorous costumes, flowing gowns, and delicate makeup. In this feminine presentation, he performed extremely dangerous aerial stunts, including trapeze routines and wire walking, with calm confidence and graceful control. The audience, believing they were watching a woman risk her life in the air, often responded with awe and concern. Every movement was precise, every gesture intentional, creating a powerful sense of beauty and suspense at the climax of performance. Barbette would remove his wig and reveal his male identity. This moment transformed the act from a thrilling circus performance into a bold statement. The sudden shift forced audiences to reconsider everything they had just witnessed. The danger, grace, and strength they admired were no longer attached to a single gender. Instead, Barbette showed that skill and artistry existed beyond traditional definitions of masculinity and femininity. In this way, his performances challenged deeply rooted assumptions without using words. Barbette's work attracted the attention of artists and thinkers far beyond the world of entertainment. He became especially popular in Europe, where members of the artistic and intellectual elite were drawn to the symbolic nature of his act. Influential figures in the Surrealist movement praised the performances as living art. French writer Jean Cocteau, in particular, admired Barbette and wrote about his ability to blur the line between illusion and reality. For these audiences, Barbette was not simply an entertainer, but a philosopher of movement and identity. Unlike many gender nonconforming performers who were limited to nightclubs or vaudeville circuits, Barbette achieved international recognition. He performed in prestigious venues across Europe and America, including famous theaters and casinos. His success proved that audiences were capable of appreciating complex and challenging ideas when they were presented with beauty and skill. However, like many performers who push boundaries, his fame did not guarantee long-term security. As entertainment trends changed and cultural attitudes hardened, Barbette gradually faded from the spotlight. He continued to perform for many years, but never again reached the same level of fame he once enjoyed. When he died in 1973, his contributions were acknowledged with an obituary in the New York Times, a rare honor for a performer of his kind.